Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here is, as always, to move past the headlines.
Right, to treat these big global events as, well, as high-fidelity sensor readings.
Exactly. It lets us analyze the underlying mechanics of global power. And today, we're digging into an event that generated just immense friction in late 2025.
We're talking about the proposal and the immediate, and I mean immediate rejection of that highly controversial 28-point peace plan for Ukraine.
And for us, the value here isn't about judging if the plan was, right or wrong, good or bad.
No, not at all. That discussion is happening everywhere else on every news channel. Our source material, which comes from some deep system analysis, really forces us to prioritize what it calls structure over impression.
Structure over impression.
So we're analyzing the raw event, the leak itself, the incredible speed of its delivery, and that visceral, almost biological reaction it provoked. We're using that to map the structural pressures that are usually hidden way beneath the geopolitical surface.
That structural analysis, it relies on a specific vocabulary, and I think we need to clarify it up front for you, the listener.
We do. We're using the lens of colliding operating systems, or OS.
Okay, and OS.
And we're also examining the gradients.
Which are the specific pressures pushing the actors.
Exactly. And then we measure the result of all that, which the sources call membrane tension.
So you shouldn't think of these terms as like corporate jargon. They're just ways to describe political mechanics. And OS is how a country processes policy.
A gradient is a force, like time pressure.
And membrane tension is the stress on the interfaces, the connections between nations.
And if you apply that lens, this proposal wasn't just some routine diplomatic blunder that happened to leak.
No.
The source material actually labels this incident an OS firing event.
An OS firing event.
It was a high-intensity, acute moment that exposed these deep, really dangerous fault lines in global power dynamics. It showed just how quickly certain elite systems can try to move outside of established institutional and, crucially, democratic channels.
Okay, so let's unpack that structural tension. The core thesis here, it seems, is that when you have these fundamentally incompatible political systems,
Right.
and they try to execute a super rapid transaction under extreme pressure, the result isn't a compromise.
It's explosive structural instability.
And that's our mission today, to understand why the system reacted so violently.
To really map the speed, which is key here, we first have to establish the timeline of events.
Okay.
Because the structural dynamics, they were fully activated across a very, very tight sequence in that last quarter of 2025.
So let's start with the trigger event. The sources point to a key date, the leak of the Ushakov-Dmitriev telephone call on October 29, 2025. Why was that specific leak, which revealed these internal Russian discussions, so significant as a structural marker for us?
Because it served as a critical baseline reading. That call and the transcripts that came out of it, they confirmed the internal priorities and the maximalist demands being formulated at the very highest levels of the Kremlin.
So we're talking Putin, Ushakov, Dmitriev.
The inner circle. It showed that the Russian OS was already formulating a plan that was rooted in securing very specific territorial gains and, just as importantly, neutralizing Ukraine's Western alignment ambitions.
So it established the input data for the policy draft that was about to come?
Yes, exactly, the input data.
And then just 3 weeks later, barely any time at all, we get the actual delivery date. The Trump administration's 28-point proposal is presented to Ukraine on November 21st, 2025.
Less than a month.
Less than a month separated the confirmed internal Russian drafting priorities and the appearance of this fully formed proposal that was sponsored by American figures. I mean, that is an almost instantaneous translation from priority to policy draft.
It is. The speed component is just. It's impossible to ignore.
Yeah.
And that what the content of the plan reinforces this operational nature.
Right. This wasn't some middle ground compromise.
Not even close. The analysis suggests it strongly reflected Russia's maximal demands. This included points that explicitly called for the de facto recognition of Russian control over territories that were the absolute core of the conflict.
Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, the big ones.
All of them. And beyond just the territorial question, the document included that critical demand for Ukraine's complete and irreversible renunciation of NATO membership.
So the analysis concludes this was, in essence, a Russian wish list that was structurally repackaged and laundered through American channels.
That's the read. And this is not, the typical starting point for international negotiation.
No. Standard diplomacy, you start with proposals that leave tons of room for compromise.
Exactly. This proposal was designed from the ground up to impose an outcome and to do it quickly. Now, the who and where of the process, that reveals the nature of what we're calling the fast secret OS.
Because this negotiation just bypassed all the normal institutional structures.
Completely. On the Russian side, it was confined to Putin and his top internal advisors, people like Ushakov and Dmitriev. They were operating right out of the Kremlin's political core.
Okay, so a very tight circle there. What about on the U.S. side?
Just as concentrated and just as extra-institutional. The sources identify Trump operating completely outside of official U.S. State Department channels.
So no foggy bottom involvement.
None. He was collaborating with private figures, advisors. You see mentions of meetings in Miami and Washington, specifically with people like Witkoff and Kushner.
So this wasn't the bureaucracy at work. This was transactional elite statecraft.
That's a perfect term for it.
And the targets of this plan, the primary target was obviously Ukraine. They were the recipient. But the structural goal, it seems like it was to strategically bypass the inherent slowness of the EU.
The EU consultation mechanisms, yes.
Yeah.
And even more critically, the U.S. Congress.
The decision to just skip these bodies, to go around them, that's the first clear signature of a system that is prioritizing speed over legitimacy.
And that leads us directly to the why. What are the incentives driving this incredible pace?
Right.
The core structural pressure identified in the source material is the high time pressure gradient that Russia was facing. Our analysis puts this pressure at a very significant 0.8.
Okay, a 0.8 time pressure gradient that's nearly critical. We need to ground this metric in reality for a second. What concrete evidence supports such a high reading of Russian pressure?
Well, it's driven by a confluence of accelerating structural costs. We're talking about rapidly escalating war costs, the expenditure of material, of manpower, of capital that is simply not sustainable over a longer timeline.
So the clock is ticking for them.
Loudly. Furthermore, you have the compounding impact of sanctions, the economic slowdown happening within the Russian domestic system, and, the internal political necessity of showing a decisive, rapid victory, not a protracted stalemate.
So all of that contributes to this acceleration demand.
It does. Russia's incentive was crystal clear. Secure maximal gains now before any of these internal or external pressures force them into a weaker negotiating position later on.
So the high pressure on the Russian system created the demand for a rapid solution. How did that connect with the U.S. side of the equation?
The incentive for the U.S. actors involved, what the sources call the deal OS, was different, but it was complementary in terms of speed.
How so?
They aimed for a rapid deal-based settlement because they viewed the conflict not through a lens of values or international law, but as a transactional problem.
Critical deal to be made.
Exactly. They saw it as something that could be quickly solved by imposing a sort of split-the-difference outcome, prioritizing the speed of conflict termination over any established normative frameworks.
Which brings us to the actual mechanism they used, which the sources call the fast secret OS route. This is the engine of speed we mentioned.
The suspected operational path is a textbook example of high-speed bypass diplomacy. The analysis suggests that the initial Russian tracks,
Their maximalist demands.
right, those were fed through select pro-Russia U.S. networks, specifically referencing individuals like Witkoff and others operating in those elite circles.
So the proposal enters a rapid private American filter.
Yes. And these contacts, they processed and reshaped the demands. They translated them from raw Russian geopolitical priorities into a structured, presentable 28-point proposal.
So this laundering process gave the proposal the appearance of American authorship, American legitimacy.
It did, and that allowed it to move completely outside the slow, deliberate process of the State Department. It was then presented to Ukraine not as a Russian offer, but as an American-authored document.
And in doing so, it bypassed allied consultation, detailed legislative oversight, all the institutional checks that are designed specifically to slow down high-stakes foreign policy decisions.
And that mechanism, which prioritizes speed and executive transaction above all else, is what defines the structural risk that we call the fast secret OS.
The sources establish that this high-speed imposition, it inevitably generates chaos when it hits the external political environment.
It has to.
And to understand that chaos, we have to use the framework of the three layers: narrative, internal value, and the operational system. Because these layers, they process political information at different speeds, which is why the reaction was so sharp.
The importance of these layers, especially for analyzing events like this one, is that they stop us from confusing noise, which is the narrative with structural resistance, the value layer, or the raw mechanics, which is the OS.
Okay, so let's look at layer one. The narrative layer, or N, This is the surface story, what the media and the public are all talking about. What was the immediate observable reaction when the 28-point plan leaked?
Well, the N layer immediately fired, and when we say fired, we mean the public sphere reacted with maximum intensity. The dominant public narrative was one of immediate and forceful criticism.
So no debate, just instant rejection.
Instant. The plan was slammed as a wish list for Russia, an unfair deal, and, fundamentally a betrayal of the principle of territorial sovereignty. The media and experts they immediately amplified crisis-oriented narratives, focusing on the negative implications of sanctioning a land for peace trade under duress.
We saw an almost total, immediate consensus in established media rejecting the plan. But if that was just noise, you'd expect it to fade pretty quickly. The analysis suggests that the N-layer reaction was amplified by something much deeper. Layer 2, the internal value layer, or I.
And that's the critical component. The I layer represents the underlying moral, the ideological, and the historical structure of the observer systems.
So we're talking about the U.S. establishment, our European allies, and of course, Ukraine itself.
Right. This is where the core non-negotiable resistance resided.
If the deal OS is just trying to rationalize the transaction, the value OS is screaming about the precedent it sets. What were the key resistance points here?
They really center on two fundamental international norms that define the entire post-World War II security architecture.
Territorial sovereignty and the principle of non-impunity for aggression.
Right, you can't be rewarded for invading your neighbor.
Exactly. The value OS, which is particularly strong in established democratic systems, views any deal that validates an aggressor's gains as a catastrophic structural failure. It sets a precedent that undermines the entire international system. To accept this proposal was to actively violate these core values.
And the sources reference a concept, core field B emotion, as gradient. So the intensity of the public fury, that strong, immediate rejection, it wasn't just random noise.
Yeah, it was a measure of where the political pressure was focused, and it confirmed that this plan hit the value OS head-on.
The distrust was also just extremely acute, right?
Yeah.
Especially around the secrecy of the whole process, the bypassing of democratic oversight.
Absolutely. And there was this profound wariness, this suspicion regarding the observed alignment between Russian autocracy and what the sources label the Trump-style deal OS. So this collision of fundamentally incompatible value systems, transactional expediency on one side versus normative principle on the other, that's what generated the immense heat in this I layer.
That's the heat.
Okay, so that's the resistance. Now let's return to layer 3, the operational system layer, the OS. This is the mechanics of how the policy was delivered. What defines the fast secret OS that the 28-point plan used?
It's defined by its operational speed and its total avoidance of structural friction. The Fast Secret OS is a system of U.S. and Russian elite diplomacy where a very narrow group attempts to achieve strategic goals by bypassing every established institutional speed bump.
So things like the Allied consultation process, the required legislative approval in Congress for major security policy changes,
No pass.
or the formal multilateral negotiation bodies that are supposed to ensure accountability.
All ignored.
It's the difference between sending a registered letter through the mail system and having a private jet deliver a briefcase directly to the recipient's door.
That is a perfect analogy. The slow, legitimate OS, the standard democratic machinery, is designed for accountability, for transparency, and for consensus. And that inherently makes it slow.
Yeah.
That's a feature, not a bug.
Right.
The Fast Secret OS, on the other hand, prioritizes speed and maximalist results dictated by a few influential actors who are operating on the premise that the ends justify the means.
Even if those means completely undermine institutional legitimacy.
Especially then. And the attempt to force the outcome of this Fast Secret OS onto the slow, value-driven democratic systems is what generated the structural crisis that followed.
So we have established the collision, rapid mechanics colliding with deep, slow values.
If we accept that analogy of the political structure as a complex machine, then this instantaneous policy attempt, the 28-point plan, it acted like a sudden burst of acceleration in one single component.
While all the connected components were struggling to keep pace.
Exactly. And the resulting friction, the heat, the structural instability, that is what we term speed shear.
Speed shear. It's the analytical term for the friction that's generated when different layers of political reality are operating at these vastly different velocities. It's what separates a normal policy debate from a true structural risk.
That's the key distinction.
So what were the specific speeds that the analysis detected in this event?
The analysis provides a really stark contrast. The OS speed of the secret channel, The mechanism that drafted and presented the proposal was assessed as extremely fast. It scored a zero point 0.9.
Zero point 0.9. On a scale where 1.0 is basically instantaneous, 0.9 suggests this channel was operating at maximum velocity. It was designed specifically to create a fait accompli before any resistance could even organize.
In concrete terms, a zero point 0.9 speed means the proposal went from being a maximalist draft request in Russia to a finalized, high-level proposal on the global stage in less than a month.
Okay, so that's the fast part. Now, compare that to the narrative speed.
Right, the speed at which Congress, the EU institutions, and the public sphere could even process and respond to this sudden draft. That was assessed at a medium to slow velocity of just 0.45.
Wow. That is more than a 100% difference in speed between the mechanism of policy deliverer and the mechanism of policy reception and vetting.
And this is the critical velocity difference. Political institutions, which are designed for deliberation, for consultation, for consensus building, they simply cannot process and respond effectively to a fully formed, high-stakes draft plan that just appears out of nowhere at zero point 0.9 speed.
It's impossible. The time required for legislative hearings, for allied consultations, for internal debate, all the necessary steps for a democratic system to grant legitimacy, you cannot compress that timeline so severely.
You can't. And the resulting shear created that intense friction and instability. It explains why the immediate reaction from our Democratic allies wasn't just disagreement, it was shock, it was outrage. It was a system rejection based on the violation of speed itself.
And the magnitude of this speed shear becomes the engine of conflict. But we have to remember the driving force behind the acceleration in the first place.
We do. We established that Russian internal time pressure gradient was at 0.8, and the sources emphasized this was the key accelerant for the fast secret OS.
How does a 0.8 time pressure gradient translate into this level of speed? Can we use, I don't know, a corporate analogy to make this pressure relatable?
Let's try. Think of a major corporation that's facing impending bankruptcy or a hostile takeover. That is a 20.8 pressure environment.
Okay, so total crisis mode.
Total crisis mode. The CEO, ignoring all the internal departmental advice, that's the slow OS, relies only on a handful of external advisors, the fast secret OS, to execute a radical high-risk, maximalist merger deal in 3 weeks.
Even though proper due diligence would require 3 months.
At least. The deal is necessary for survival, but the speed of its execution guarantees internal structural collapse, because the accounting, legal, and HR departments, the value OS, they simply cannot validate the outcome in time.
So in this geopolitical context, Russia needed a rapid resolution because of unsustainable costs. This necessity translated into that 0.9 OS speed,
Which then slammed into the slower, value-driven systems of the West.
causing the shear to peak. The fast secret OS was a structural necessity born from that external pressure.
And that peak shear caused the high heat and friction that we all observed as crisis rhetoric in the media.
When speed shear peaks, the structural analysis dictates that it generates what we're calling membrane tension.
Right.
We're talking about the geopolitical interfaces, the relationships between the U.S., its allies, Ukraine, and Russia. When these systems pull too aggressively against each other, the membrane that holds the consensus together, it thins, it stretches, and it approaches a state of rupture.
The crisis narratives, they weren't just about the words on the page in the 28-point plan. They were the audible sound of the system membrane stretching near its breaking points.
And the analysis measured the tension index for this specific interface, U.S., EU, Ukraine, Russia, as high, right?
Yep.
At 0.74.
A high 0.74, which is a localized critical state of stress.
And the source material describes the geometry of this stress as a Z-shaped momentary break. That sounds pretty abstract. What does that specifically mean in terms of political structure?
We need to contrast it with slower forms of stress. If the tension were caused by, say, gradual policy erosion, we might see a U-shaped or an I-shaped deterioration, a prolonged strain.
Okay.
A Z-shaped break implies a rapid, acute fourthing or tension where the stress hits suddenly and sharply without enough time for that stress to diffuse.
So like snapping a thick taut rubber band really quickly.
That's a great image. The immediate violent recoil and strain are acute, but they are also potentially localized and temporary if the system can absorb the shock. The rapid secret nature of the plan caused this acute folding.
And what were the contributing factors that were pulling this membrane in all these different directions? The analysis identifies 4 primary contributors, all working at the same time to stretch the interface.
First, U.S. internal politics, which scored a 0.7.
And this isn't about a specific policy. It's about the institutional weakness and the partisan gridlock that makes the U.S. foreign policy apparatus so unreliable right now.
Exactly. When U.S. leadership itself is a source of high volatility, allies naturally pull away from the common center. That point 7 reflects the structural distrust that U.S. allies now place in the continuity of American policy, regardless of which administration is in power.
Okay, so that's the first poll. What's second?
Second, EU discomfort and resistance. At a point 6, European allies were fundamentally resistant to a unilateral land for peace deal that contradicted the established post-WWII security principles that they rely upon for their own safety. They pulled back on the membrane to protect their value OS.
And then you have the two pressures driving the acceleration.
Right. Russian time pressure at point 8, which is the primary pulling force demanding speed, and then the war costs themselves, assessed at point 7.5, which were feeding that time pressure.
So when you have this interface being pulled by internal U.S. weakness, by EU normative resistance, and by this extreme Russian pressure,
the interface thins dramatically, and it approaches that critical 0.74 tension state.
And this high tension leads directly to the core analytical finding here, the structural incompatibility error. If the system is this stressed, it's because the policy software, the deal itself, was fundamentally incompatible with the hardware, with the value OS.
We assessed the policy-level non-compatibility error at a staggering 0.83.
0.83. That's huge.
It is. This index suggests that the proposed solution, while it might seem rational to a certain type of OS, is nearly impossible to run on the value OS and normative OS structures of Ukraine and Europe.
I have to challenge this point for a second. Diplomacy is, by its very definition, about compromise. Why is a concept of trade territory for a ceasefire categorized as a 0.83 error index? Isn't that just hyperbole for a deal people didn't like?
That's a crucial distinction to make. Compromise involves sacrificing secondary goals while you maintain your core principles. It operates within a shared normative OS. The deal OS, however, views the conflict purely transactionally. Reduce expenditure, terminate hostility, achieve a measurable outcome. For that OS, trading land for peace appears completely rational. But this approach completely ignores the concept of irrevocability and legitimacy.
Can you elaborate on that difference between a legitimate compromise and a transactional imposition?
Sure. In a legitimate compromise, territorial changes are agreed upon through established legal frameworks, often after a conflict is resolved, and they're seen as irreversible.
Right.
The 28-point proposal, however, attempted to validate gains that were secured through aggression and impose a settlement via a secret, non-institutional channel.
This is what triggers that high incompatibility index, because it attacks the structural integrity of the normative OS itself.
And where did this 0.83 error manifest most clearly in the system? At two critical collision points, or what the sources call critical pairs. The first is the U.S. deal OS colliding with the Ukraine value OS. For Ukraine, the core value is sovereignty and the non-reversibility of international norms. To accept this proposal isn't a tactical retreat. It's a strategic, structural failure that validates the premise that might makes right and that sovereignty is negotiable under duress.
Okay, that's one. What's the other collision point?
The second is between the Russian maximal demand OS and the European narrative OS. The European system is built on international consensus and the principle of non-impunity for aggression. Laundering Russia's maximal gains through an American back channel is structurally unacceptable because it would reward aggression and undermine the very foundation of European security architecture.
So the high OS non-compatibility index, that 0.83, that's the real warning sign. It signifies that even if political pressure could somehow force the deal through, the underlying systems, the democratic value OS, would never recognize its legitimacy.
Which virtually guarantees future systemic breakdown, or worse, renewed conflict. That is the long-term risk. The system may execute the policy, but it will ultimately reject the outcome, setting up the next cycle of instability.
We established that the political reaction to this was extremely visceral. I mean, politicians, allies, media, they all called it a crisis.
The framework suggests we should treat these reactions not as bias, but as valid measurements of the system's stress.
Right. We need to analyze the observer response itself using what's called the observer firing model, or OFM.
The OFM is crucial then because in these complex political events, the noise is often the signal.
It is. We quantify the observer's reaction to confirm if their alarm bells, their firing, actually corresponds to the structural tension we've measured independently.
So what was the quantified intensity of those alarm bells?
The firing intensity, so the volume and the certainty of the condemnation, the frequent use of crisis language, that was measured at 0.78.
Okay, 0.78. And what makes this reading so significant is its strong correlation with the independent structural measurement of membrane tension, which you'll remember we assessed at 0.74.
A near perfect correlation. 0.78 firing intensity versus 0.74 structural tension. This confirms that the strong crisis narratives, they weren't just media fabrication.
Not at all. They were accurately registering a true, measurable high-tension zone in the political system interface. The sensor fired because the membrane was genuinely stressed.
And we also check for dissonance, right? Because observers always have an inherent bias.
Always. The analysis looks at what's called the dissonance vector to see if that bias is obscuring the truth. In this case, it was assessed at 0.42.
Which is in the moderate range.
Right. So it suggests that while observer bias exists, the core structural reading, that high tension, is fundamentally valid and reliable. We can separate the heat of the opinion from the reality of the pressure.
We can trust the thermometer even if the person holding it feels very strongly about the weather.
Exactly. The OFM analysis also isolated the shear origin vector, which confirmed where the stress was coming from. It showed that the primary stress came directly from the OS layer. That's the 0.9 speed, and the value layer, the 0.8 resistance.
So that confirms that the collision of incompatible speeds and deep values was the root cause of the system firing.
It was the root cause.
Okay, let's synthesize all of these pressures by reviewing the final gradient memo summary. This should bring together all the data points that define the current state of play.
The memo confirms the dominance of the key gradients we've been discussing. Russia time pressure holding firm at 0.8. Democratic value resistance at a strong 0.7, and that U.S. elite OS speed at a critically high 0.9.
Given those high-pressure readings, especially with two key operational points hovering between 0.8 and 0.9, what is the overall state assessment that the source material assigns?
The structural state is labeled quasi-critical.
Quasi.
This assessment is key. It means the system is currently stressed beyond its normal capacity, but it hasn't yet reached the point of immediate irreversible collapse or a phase transition.
But it is highly susceptible to nonlinear changes.
Extremely.
What are the real-world implications of operating continuously in a quasi-critical state, and what exactly is a nonlinear jump in this context?
Well, the implication is structural instability and profound unpredictability. A nonlinear jump isn't a gradual deterioration. It's a sudden, disproportionate change in the system's state. For example, if the fast secret OS accelerates even further, maybe it achieves a speed of 1.0, or if the value-based resistance increases from 0.7 to 0.9.
And the system is primed to fail suddenly.
That's the risk.
What would that look like politically?
It could be a sudden major policy break, an allied nation permanently rupturing ties over the perceived lack of institutional legitimacy. It could be a complete collapse of trust in the U.S. diplomatic apparatus, or a massive, immediate legislative backlash that forces a drastic, embarrassing policy reversal.
The system suddenly lurching from 0.9 speed down to 0.1, causing even bigger shockwaves.
Exactly. And that high-RS non-compatibility index of 0.83 confirms that the current policy configuration is structurally unsustainable and risks driving that very jump.
It's not the fall that gets you, it's the sudden stop.
Precisely. The attempt to impose speed over values created friction that pushed the entire structure right to the edge of the cliff. #NAC_outro.
This analysis provides just a profound way to look at global politics. The core lesson for you, the listener, is that understanding these operational mechanics, the OS, the speed shear, the membrane tension, it offers a powerful predictive edge over just following the day-to-day headline narratives.
Right.
The structural event here was not the plan itself, it was the mechanism of its rejection, and that allowed us to map the latent, dangerous pressures in the international system.
And we achieved our goal. We moved beyond asking if the 28-point plan was right or wrong. Instead, we used its proposal and rejection as a kind of X-ray to map these invisible pressures and structural errors.
And the high incompatibility index is the crucial long-term risk.
It is, because it demonstrates that the basic assumptions guiding certain powerful OS layers, the idea that speed and transactional efficiency can just override norms, are fundamentally rejected by the normative and value layers of key democratic actors. The system pushed back, not just politically, but structurally.
The system simply refused to accept the imposition of speed over values, But the effort that was required to reject it exposed the fragility of the democratic architecture.
And that fragility leads us to our final provocative thought. The source material suggests the observer reaction itself was a valid measurement of instability.
So if the political world is now routinely relying on these fast, secret OS routes, bypassing established checks and balances to solve immense problems,
And they're driven by these high-pressure gradients, like Russia's existential need for speed.
then how long can the slow, value-driven democratic systems possibly keep up without suffering catastrophic speed shear? What does a consistent high-velocity difference mean for the concept of legitimate policymaking, which is predicated on deliberation, transparency, and consensus?
Something for you to mull or explore on your own.